Battle of Solferino in 1859, Swiss businessman Henry Dunant went to visit wounded soldiers after the battle. He was shocked by the lack of facilities, personnel, and medical aid available to these soldiers. And this experience inspired Dunant to propose a permanent relief agency for humanitarian aid in times of war and a government treaty recognizing the neutrality of this agency and allowing it to provide aid in a war zone. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we're talking about the Geneva Protocol, the Convention, and the violations of the protocol or history. So after he returned from the war, Henry Dunant chronicled his experience in a book called A Memory of Solferino in 1862. And it is here that he captured all the horrors of war and his experience during that period that he had witnessed. His proposal of a permanent relief agency for humanitarian aid during wartime led to the establishment of the Red Cross in Geneva. And this in turn led to the 1864 Geneva Convention, which became the first codified international treaty that covered the sick and the wounded soldiers on the battlefield. The Swiss government invited the governments of all European countries, as well as the United States, Brazil, and Mexico, to attend the official diplomatic conference. 16 countries sent a total of about 26 delegates to Geneva. And on 22nd of August, 1864, the conference adopted the first Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded in armies in the field. Representatives of 12 states and kingdoms signed the convention. In October of 1868, the first attempt was made to expand the 1864 treaty to cover maritime warfare. The articles were signed, but were only ratified by the Netherlands and the US, and Netherlands later withdrew the ratification. And the protection of the victims of maritime warfare would later be realized by the Third Hague Convention of 1899 and the 10th Hague Convention of 1907. So far, the articles of the Geneva Convention were focused on the wounded and the sick in the armed forces in the field. But in 1929, for the first time, the articles of the convention focused on the treatment of prisoners of war. Several protections were identified, but the key ones, which were the general protections, stated that the prisoners of war are the responsibility of the state, not the person who captures them, and that they may not be transferred to a state that was not party to the Geneva Convention. And secondly, the prisoners of war must be treated humanely without any adverse discrimination, and their medical needs must be met. Included in these treaties were also things like the release and repatriation of prisoners of war at the close of hostilities, and also some conditions around the death of prisoners of war. And the set of treaties in 1929 were significantly revised at the 1949 conference post World War II. Now, despite the length and the depth of these documents, what began to be more clear over a period of time was the very nature of armed conflicts was changing. At the beginning of the Cold War era, there was a feeling that most armed conflicts had become internal, like civil wars, while on the other hand, most wars had become increasingly asymmetric. But one thing was becoming very clear, that the wars were increasingly creating a higher toll on civilians. And because of that, this brought a need to expand the charter in the Fourth Geneva Convention to include protection of civilians. So the Fourth Geneva Convention, adopted in August of 1949, came into force in October of 1950 and became the first to deal with the humanitarian protection for civilians in a war zone. So these 4 protocols or conventions are together called the Geneva Convention. And it was in 1993 that the United Nations Security Council adopted a report from the Secretary General and a commission of experts which concluded that the Geneva Conventions had passed into the body of customary international law, which meant they were binding even on non-signatories to the convention whenever they engaged in armed conflicts. So after 1993, whether or not you were a signatory to the Geneva Convention, if you indulged in armed conflict, you were accountable towards upholding the tenets of the convention. So with the inclusion of protection for civilians, it felt like the Geneva Convention had covered most aspects. Well, creation is always easy. Enforcement is the challenge. The Vietnam War would become a war where the Geneva Protocol would be violated by different parties with respect to different aspects. And one of these would be the My Lai massacre of March 1968. On March 16, 1968, during the course of the Vietnam War, between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians were killed by US Army soldiers from various companies and battalions. And this happened in the Son Tin district of South Vietnam. The victims included men, women, children, and infants. Some of the women were even gang raped and their bodies mutilated, as were the children as young as 12. 26 American soldiers were charged with criminal offenses, but only one, Lieutenant William Calley Jr., a platoon leader in the C Company, was convicted. Found guilty of murdering 22 villagers, he was originally given a life sentence, but served 3.5 years under house arrest after President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence. This war crime alone was later called the most shocking episode of the Vietnam War. The incident prompted global outrage when it became public knowledge in November of 1969, and it contributed to domestic opposition to the US involvement in the Vietnam War, mainly because of the scope of killing and the cover-up attempts. And what was worse was that initially 3 US servicemen who had tried to halt the massacre and rescue the hiding civilians were shunned and even denounced as traitors by several US congressmen, including Mendel Rivers, Democrat from South Carolina, and chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. 30 years later, these servicemen were finally recognized and decorated, one posthumously by the US Army for shielding non-combatants from harm in a war zone. This, along with No Gun Rai massacre in South Korea 18 years earlier during the Korean War, was one of the largest publicized massacres of civilians by US forces in the 20th century. So this was the US side of a violation during the Vietnam War. What about the opposition? That is the Viet Cong. Well, 5 December 1967, 2 battalions of Viet Cong attacked the Dak Son village, and after a battle with the defense militia, killed between 114 and 252 civilians in a vengeance attack on the hamlet of Dak Son. The Viet Cong believed that the hamlet had at one point given aid to refugees fleeing Viet Cong forces. Troops marched into a village near Dak Son, and some of them were flamethrowers. And as the Viet Cong fired their weapons, people were incinerated inside their own homes. And some who had managed to escape into foxholes in their homes died of smoke inhalation. The homes that were not destroyed by the flamethrowers were destroyed with grenades. And on the way out, patches of the main town were set afire. And just before they left the village, the Viet Cong shot 60 of the 160 survivors, and most of the remaining villagers were taken hostage. This incident is known as the Dak Son Massacre. Now, after World War I, in an effort to avoid repetition of the atrocities committed by the combating armies in World War I, a set of treaties was added to the Geneva Protocol focused on containing or banning the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. And it was drafted at the 1925 Geneva Conference. So well before World War II, the global community has already looked at ways to avoid chemical and biological warfare. And that means they full well understand the deadly effects of doing so. But once again, in Vietnam, a biological weapon would be used, which consisted of an equal measure of two powerful herbicides, 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid and 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, aka Agent Orange. The US and the United Kingdom had begun testing weaponized herbicides during World War II to disrupt enemy food supplies. But Agent Orange was not ready to use until 1946, after the war had already ended. The British were the first to use Agent Orange during their 1950s colonial war against Malaysia, known as the Malaysian Emergency. So in 1961, as the conflict in Vietnam began to heat up, the anti-communist regime in Saigon, which was propped up by the US, asked for American aid in their fight to put down the communist uprising in the South. In August of that year, the US launched Operation Ranch Hand, which saw the US and South Vietnam Air Forces spray Agent Orange and other chemicals on the jungles and countryside. While some questioned the legality of using these chemicals in warfare, Secretary of State Dean Rusk assured then President JFK that the British had shown it as an acceptable means of warfare. Now, there were two main goals for Operation Ranch Hand. The first one was to deprive foliage cover for the Viet Cong troops and personnel moving through the jungles, and the second was to destroy crops that the US felt the Viet Cong may use to feed soldiers and supporters. The fact that farms and crops are clearly civilian targets didn't seem to bother the military leaders in Washington, and the crops were often in or near civilian villages, and the herbicide destroyed and poisoned their food supply. There were protests across the US and much of the world in response to the barbaric use of chemical weapons, and many anti-war groups, human rights groups, and leaders of scientific communities demanded the end of this crime. In 1966, nations opposed to using chemical weapons under the Geneva Treaty brought resolutions before the United Nations to stop their use in Vietnam. The US argued that since defoliant target trees and vegetations, it couldn't be considered a chemical weapon because chemical weapons target people. When countries brought more resolutions before the UN, the American government argued that if it were to be accused of chemical warfare, the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth must be charged because of their use in 1950s in Malaysia. And this forced the British and their Commonwealth allies to staunchly back the US position. Operation Ranch Hand continued from 1961 through 1971. During this time, US military forces sprayed 5.6 million acres of land in South Vietnam, in addition to parts of Laos and Cambodia, with these poisons. 90% of those lands were sprayed at least twice. An estimated nearly 5 million Vietnamese citizens were directly exposed to these toxins. Yeah, it is easy to create laws. Enforcement is where the rubber hits the road. So we are able to see the more powerful nations flout the protocol and get away with it. But what about the less powerful nations? Are they at least able to maintain the protocol? Surprisingly, no. And a clear and painful example of this is the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. In December of 1975, Indonesian military invaded East Timor under the pretext of anti-colonialism and anti-communism to overthrow the Fretilin regime that had emerged in 1974. And this overthrow of the popular and Fretilin-led government sparked a violent quarter-century occupation in which approximately 100,000 to 180,000 soldiers and civilians are estimated to have been killed or starved to death. The Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation in East Timor documented a minimum estimate of 102,000 conflict-related deaths in East Timor during the 1974 through 1999 period, which included 18,600 violent killings, 84,200 deaths from disease and starvation. Indonesian forces and their auxiliaries combined were responsible for 70% of these killings. In December of 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution that strongly deplored Indonesia's invasion of East Timor and demanded that Jakarta withdraw troops without delay and allow the inhabitants of the island to exercise their right to self-determination. And the resolution also requested the UN Security Council to take urgent action to protect East Timor's territorial integrity. On 22nd December 1975, the UN Security Council met and unanimously passed a resolution similar to the General Assembly's and called upon the UN Secretary General to send urgently a special representative to East Timor for the purpose of making an on-the-spot assessment of the existing situation and of establishing contacts with all parties in the territory and all states concerned to ensure the implementation of the current resolution. And what was the reason for letting this go on? The Clinton administration officials told the New York Times that the US support for Indonesia's Suharto was driven by a potent mix of power politics and emerging markets. Suharto was Washington's favored ruler in the ultimate emerging market who deregulated the economy and opened Indonesia to foreign investors. He's our kind of guy, said a senior administration official who dealt on Asian policy. Philip Lechty, a senior CIA officer in Indonesia, stated that he had intelligence that came from firm sources in East Timor, and there were people being herded into school buildings and set on fire. There were people herded into fields and machine gunned. The place was a free fire zone and Suharto was given the green light. It was only 25 years after the start of the invasion, in 1999, when a majority of East Timorese finally got a chance to vote, and they did vote overwhelmingly for independence. And finally, East Timor achieved independence on 20th of May, 2002. In the end, the only conclusion is that while the Geneva Protocol put the spotlight on war crimes and protecting civilians and avoiding humanitarian disasters, its effectiveness on achieving the same has been virtually invisible. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. After the breakup of Yugoslavia into 6 countries, what country is Belgrade the capital of? The answer is B, Serbia. Question for the current episode. After the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials post-World War II, what was the next formal international prosecution of war crimes via a tribunal? Was it A, the territory of former Yugoslavia since 1991, B, for the Vietnam War, C, for the territory of former Rwanda, or D, for the territory of East Timor since 1975? Once again, After the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials post-World War II, what was the next formal international prosecution of war crimes conducted via a tribunal? A. Territory of former Yugoslavia since 1991. B. The Vietnam War. C. The territory of former Rwanda. Or D. The territory of East Timor since 1975. The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at the newly independent nation of Pakistan after the partition with India and see what factors and circumstances, economic, political, geographic, and strategic, led to the shaping up of Pakistan. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.